The long run home. The dirt path twisted ahead, climbing gently through the trees, the scent of damp earth rising with the morning mist. Jack had been running for hours, his legs moving on instinct, his breath steady. He no longer counted miles or cared about pace. This was how he ran now. Not for medals, not for records, just for the movement, the rhythm, the quiet. A younger man in a bright racing singlet approached from the opposite direction, his strides quick, efficient. As they passed, the runner gave a nod. "Hey!" The kid called over his shoulder, slowing. "You running the Ridge Ultra next month?" Jack smiled, shaking his head. "Not anymore. Those days are behind me." The younger runner hesitated. "You used to." Jack chuckled. 4 finishes at the 100-mile distance, back when I still had something to prove. He glanced at the sun filtering through the canopy. "Now, I just run." The kid fell in beside him for a few strides. "But why stop racing? You're still out here." Jack considered the question. The races had been battles, against the course, the clock, himself. He had chased cutoffs, conquered mountains, pushed through nights alone with nothing but a headlamp and the sound of his own breath. He had felt the thrill of crossing a 100-mile finish line, but also the deep fatigue of knowing he'd have to find the will to do it all over again. "I love the races," Jack finally said, "but I love the run more." The younger runner nodded, thoughtful. After a moment, he picked up his pace. "See you out here," he called before disappearing down the trail. Jack kept running, the forest thinning as he neared the road. Asphalt now, the steady hum of the city ahead. His past lay behind him in the footprints along the trail. His future stretched forward, one quiet step at a time, and that was enough. Chapter 2. The First Strides. Montreal, winter of '82. Snow piled high along the sidewalks, the air sharp with cold. Inside the YMCA on Stanley Street, the weight room smelled of sweat and iron, the clang of plates filling the air. Jack had come here for strength training, not running. He was lean but not yet a runner, just a guy looking for a way to stay in shape. That's when he met Rich. Rich was built like a middle-distance runner, compact, all sinew and efficiency. He wasn't one of the muscle-bound guys grunting over barbells. Instead, he moved with purpose, his warm-ups casual, his focus sharp. Jack noticed how the guy never wasted time. It intrigued him. "You ever run?" Rich asked one day, watching Jack finish a set. "Not really," Jack admitted. "Just for fitness, here and there." Rich grinned. "You should come out for a run with us. Saturday morning, Mount Royal? We meet at the base." Jack hesitated. He wasn't sure running was his thing, but something in Rich's easy confidence made him curious. Saturday morning came, and Jack found himself standing at the foot of the mountain, breath fogging in the cold. A small group had gathered, runners of different ages, chatting and bouncing on their toes. Rich clapped him on the shoulder. "Just stay relaxed," he said. "We'll take it easy." Easy. That was a lie. The first mile up the trail burned. Jack's lungs rebelled. His legs felt leaden, but he kept moving, stubborn enough not to stop. The others ran effortlessly, gliding over the packed snow. Somewhere near the top, it happened, the rhythm. His breath synced with his stride. The discomfort faded, and for a few fleeting moments, he felt weightless. By the time they looped back down, Jack was spent. But something had shifted. Rich clapped him on the back. "Not bad for a first run." Jack nodded, grinning through his exhaustion. He had no idea that this was the beginning, that in 30 years, he'd still be running. He only knew one thing. He'd be back next Saturday. Chapter 3. The Bill Lewis 5K. Race morning smelled like wet pavement and nervous energy. Jack stood at the start line of the Bill Lewis 5K, a cluster of runners shifting and stretching around him. Some wore singlets with club logos, others old cotton t-shirts, their shoes caked with past miles. He scanned the crowd for Rich, but in the sea of bodies, his training partner had disappeared. Jack wasn't sure what to expect. It was just 5 kilometers, nothing compared to the mountain runs Rich had dragged him through, but this felt different. It was official. There was a start line, a finish, and a clock that didn't care how new he was to this world. The gun fired. The surge startled him. The pack lurched forward, fast. He tried to settle in, but the energy of the crowd pulled him faster than he'd planned. Somewhere ahead, Rich was already gone. Jack focused on his breath, the sound of footfalls around him, the slap of sneakers on wet asphalt. Then, something shifted. He passed one runner, then another. The idea had never crossed his mind before. Racing wasn't about finishing. It was about placing. As the course looped through tree-lined streets, Jack stole a glance over his shoulder. There were people behind him. A lot of people. That was a dangerous realization. He pushed harder, his breath ragged, legs burning. The final stretch came into view, lined with spectators clapping and shouting. Jack emptied the tank, crossing the finish line in a blur. Hands on his knees, gasping, he realized something else. He wanted more of this. Rich found him after, grinning. "Not bad for your first time," he said, handing Jack a cup of water. Jack barely heard him. He was too busy inspecting his loot bag, a banana, a granola bar, a discount coupon for running shoes, and best of all, his first race t-shirt, white cotton, too big, the event name printed proudly across the front. He had arrived at NN, moving to Victoria, BC, Chapter 4, the Marathoner's Road. Jack had never been one for excuses, but today, something wasn't working. His legs felt sluggish, his breathing shallow, and every step along Dallas Road sent a dull ache through his quads. The waterfront course was one he knew well, stretching from the breakwater past Clover Point. But this morning, it felt longer than usual. Rob jogged beside him, sensing the struggle. Hitting the wall, he asked, barely winded. "Feels like it," Jack admitted. He had read about this moment, the dreaded barrier in a marathon, usually around the last 6 kilometers, when the body ran low on glycogen and the mind started whispering doubts. He hadn't expected to feel it on a training run. Rob gave a knowing nod. "That's why we train. You've got the 3-hour target in your head. But time won't mean a thing if you don't learn to push through this." Jack exhaled sharply. Yeah, I get it. It's the journeyman mentality, right?" Rob grinned. "Exactly. We show up, we put in the work. No shortcuts." Jack had been showing up, running each morning, balancing fatherhood and training. He'd spent years building up his restaurant back in Montreal, pouring himself into late nights and long hours, until the weight of it became too much. Selling up and moving to Victoria, BC, had been a fresh start, a chance to rebuild, this time with running at the center of his life. He had joined the Prairie and Harriers running club, but his real training had come from the lunchtime runners from the rail at the downtown, where these were no-nonsense guys who hammered out hard runs on short breaks, squeezing in miles between work and life. Their workouts had taught him how to handle discomfort, but today, as he fought through the fatigue, he found himself questioning everything. Rob's voice cut through his thoughts. "What's in your shoe?" Jack glanced down. He had been unconsciously favoring his right foot. He stopped and lifted it, hooking out a pebble in his tread. Rob smirked. "That's the metaphor of the day. You deal with the small things before they become big ones." Jack sighed, shaking his head. "I used to think the hard part was just getting out the door. But it's this, isn't it? The grind, the drive." Rob grinned at him. "You're learning?" Jack had always been a solo driver in life, rarely leaning on others. even with his wife and son supporting him. But running, especially marathon training, was teaching him that endurance wasn't just about physical strength. It was about resilience, patience, and knowing when to push forward despite every reason to stop. His first marathon was approaching, and he'd face that last 6K again, but next time, he'd be ready. Chapter 5. The Merriman Trail. The trail dipped into a low, boggy stretch, the air thick with the earthy scent of wet cedar and decaying leaves. Jack's feet splashed through a shallow puddle, the cold seeping into his shoes. He slowed, taking in the dense undergrowth along the path, where hardy shrubs thrived in the damp soil. The leathery leaves released a faint, resinous aroma as he brushed past, a scent that reminded him of the deep wilderness. He had run this way countless times, but today, he paused, just for a moment, to take it all in. The forest here had a different rhythm, quieter, untouched by the steady pulse of the city beyond the trees. A distant bird call echoed through the branches, breaking the silence before fading again. Jack inhaled deeply, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs, then exhaled, watching the mist of his breath disappear into the morning light. He knew he would keep moving soon. His body craved the motion, but for now, he allowed himself to be still. Some trails were meant to be run, but others were meant to be remembered. Chapter 6. The early days of ultra-distance running. Chapter 6. The early years of my ultra running. The Courtenay to Nanaimo Ultra 120K was a relay event with around 300 runners, but only 2 ultra runners took on the full distance. With no aid stations on the course, runners had to be completely self-sufficient or have a support crew. The race began in the early morning at the Thrifty Foods parking lot in Courtenay, where I watched the birth of an event. Matt, my fellow ultra runner, arrived just in time, signed his waiver, and we set off together at 4 a.m. We ran side by side for 6 hours, keeping each other company, with Matt aiming for a 12:30 finish and me hoping for 13 hours. Our partnership ended when I struggled to eat half a sandwich, something surprisingly difficult when running long distances, while Matt kept moving ahead. I didn't see him again until the finish line at the stadium, where the atmosphere was electric. As I entered, I felt an Olympic moment, with the crowd cheering and the theme from Chariots of Fire playing in my head. The standing ovation from the beer tent was my 15 minutes of fame, though it had taken 13 hours to earn it. In the end, both Matt and I crushed the course record, he by 3 hours, and I by 2, making it a day to remember.